do you have any personal ideas or examples for how this idea of Moloch alchemy can apply really, really locally, like within your friendships or within your marriages and family, that kind of thing?
Yes and no. Yes, it can apply. And you actually don't want your friendships and marriages to have game theory as their primary driver, no matter what, even a race to the top. I don't want to be trying to outcompete my wife for who's nicer to each other. Like, that's just the wrong fucking head frame. So what I'm talking about with converting Moloch is insofar as there are competitive relationships, there are relationships that have real kind of agency competition going on. Can we make races to the top? But that doesn't mean that all action is game theory mediated. So when I'm talking about converting Moloch, that's actually not a game B idea. It's a game A to game B transitional idea, right? Game B idea is anti-rivalrous relationships in which Moloch is not actually a thing. The underlying kind of game theory. So now if we say in your local environment, are there plenty of rivalrous relationships that can move in the right direction? Yeah, like having a subculture define cool differently in a way that creates a gradient ascent is actually a really fucking valuable thing to do. And you know, and this is like basic shit, but very basic principles around virtue of, if there's a guy who's doing something kind of better than you, and some other friends and chicks and whatever are noticing it, and you feel some competitive impulse, don't try to bring him down ever. Just try to get better yourself. Like take it as a impulse of the right kind of competition, to be like, oh, I'm only feeling that because, and you can take this two different ways. I'm only feeling this because of some wounded childhood insecurity. Let's just heal that. That's also important. And sometimes because there's something I actually respect there. And it's actually a cue for me to notice that there's an area that I value and desire and respect that I feel like I could step into more. So that's an example of like positive competition or positive Moloch type dynamics. If you think about the bases of rivalry from an evolutionary bio perspective, it's survival, selection, and mate selection, right? Like primarily those things. So it's getting stuff and it's getting mates. Like that, the deepest evolutionary signal is mostly those things. And so obviously getting stuff is the one that has this particularly unbounded characteristic in a situation where you're not just doing survival stuff, but you can amass billions of dollars. So we're talking about that. But as far as mate selection goes, you've probably all heard various people talk about it. I think Brett Weinstein has probably talked about it publicly the most, in a way that's adjacent to this group, of if women redefined what was sexy, whatever the answer of what they defined was, is what all guys would do. Because if there was this is actually kind of interesting. I'll digress for a moment. One of critique that Brett gave me years ago when we met of the sexual liberation movement, I thought was actually quite insightful, and it was one I hadn't thought of before that, was with birth control, we decoupled sex from procreation. There's a lot that was awesome about that, and I don't think anybody wants to go back to a pre-birth control world. But there was also some major downsides, which was it's much less costly evolutionarily for a man to have sex than for a woman to have sex, because he possibly can have this toxic mating strategy of spread your seed and bail, and she can't, right? Like that's something she just physiologically can't do. So she obviously has an evolutionary impetus to ensure a kind of bonding that can raise that child, because our extended helpless neoteny and extended gestation period make it much harder on humans to raise babies than other species. And that when we decoupled those, when they were coupled, now this is not exactly true. And if we go back and look at some cultures that had polyandry versus polygamy versus multi-male, multi-female systems versus 100 different social implementations of monogamy. So they'll all be different. So I'm just going to say a very generalized trend as a starting place here. In a enforced monogamy through social shaming culture, like much of the kind of Western civilization in the Victorian age on has been, at least. If a woman didn't want to raise kids with a guy, she also didn't want to have sex with him, because especially pre-birth control, she couldn't guarantee that having sex with a guy didn't result in having a baby. So he had to actually be good father material to get laid. Now, good father material corresponds to good citizen much, much more than just good lay corresponds to good citizen. Because a guy can be a good lay and be an utter asshole, but he can't actually be a good father and be an utter asshole. Good father means that he can provide and he can be tempered and he can stay in something for a long time and he can prioritize somebody other than himself. And, you know, father and family person. And so there was something around, so this is then where the slut shaming thing becomes a big deal, or whore shaming, and like, let's make sure that no women ever fuck men outside of marriage, because we don't want to create an evolutionary niche for guys who are assholes to get laid. If a guy's an asshole, if a guy wouldn't be a good father, we want him to never be layable, so that all the men have a race to become the guy that would be a better father. So women's freedom of selection is actually selecting for something that is good for the society, right? So that's a very interesting kind of thing. So there were actually some people who predicted that following the sexual liberation movement, we would get something like the pickup artist movement, which is a evolutionary niche that grows for guys who are assholes who can get laid. So now, is this women's responsibility to say, now there's also a multipolar trap, because a particular woman can say, okay, I'm not going to fuck the guy who seems like a attractive bad boy, whatever, but wouldn't be a good father, but other women still will, so I didn't close the niche. This is why it was not only their own behavior, but the women enforcing other women type social policy. There's a lot that's tricky in here. I'm not going to suggest some kind of like traditionalist regressive move, but I'm going to say that the progressive move missed a few things. And so there's a deeper kind of analysis that has to happen. So could women start reshaping knowing that men will become that which they think will get them the best mating selection, whether they know it or not? Could women help to reshape the topology of that incentive landscape? Yeah, of course. Could men also help to reshape it? Yes, they also could. So I want to say there's responsibility for this on both parts. Could guys because a lot of guys might hear this as, okay, some beta that has an issue with violence is going to try to convince women to be attracted to something they aren't attracted to so that he can get laid, right? Like that would be the argument. So if men started developing what would make them attractive to women for evolutionary biology purposes and what would make them a good citizen virtuously simultaneously. So they were actually creating an incentive for women to start to notice that new race to the top scenario. You could have a recursion there. This is obviously a total tangent from the question you asked me, but it's an interesting one.